Carbohydrates. The main function of this macromolecule is to store energy, well, at least for the short term. It also has a really great structure that is used for transportation a lot of times and also signaling inside of your body. Most carbohydrates are found in sugars and starches. They're composed of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Starches are things like pasta, potatoes, which are more complex carbohydrates. Sugar, just by itself, is a simple carbohydrate. The monomer of a carbohydrate is called a monosaccharide. So it's close, right? In that they both have this prefix mono. That is just a single sugar of a carbohydrate. So glucose, which is the main fuel that our cells use for energy, and galactose is found in milk, and then fructose we find in fruits. A lot of these very simple monomers of carbohydrates will end in ose, and you probably know that high fructose corn syrup, you've heard of those things before. Those are all sugars that are made from different types of fruits. A polymer or polysaccharide of carbohydrates is the larger version of those molecules, or just a larger sugar molecule in general. So starch, for example, starch is used by plants in order to store, sugar. In the animal kingdom, we store sugar in the form of glycogen, and plants inside of their cell walls or just structural support inside of tree trunks, they store carbohydrates through cellulose. Now, how we get energy out of those starches is we get 4 calories per gram. A calorie is a measurement of heat, also a measurement of energy, and for every gram of it that we eat, we get 4 calories of the carbohydrate. So your body can access and break down carbohydrates really easily. Thus, it is usually the first thing that your body will turn into energy and quickly use. Because your body can break down carbohydrates rather quickly, it's its first pick in when it needs energy. All right, let's talk about lipids. Lipids are another type of energy storage. Only this time, instead of short term, it's very long term. That's kind of their main function. It's also used to insulate things like whale blubber is a lipid that whales use to insulate themselves against the cold ocean water. It's also used for protection in a lot of plants, and we also use it for structure too. You can find lipids in things that are fats, oils, also phospholipids. Phospholipids are a lining of the structure of each animal cell membrane, and we'll learn about that in a different unit. Also things like steroids. Lipids are composed of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Now, the structure of lipids is similar to a carbohydrate in that it also has a monomer, which is called a fatty acid, that makes up its polymer, which are triglycerides. Now, lipids store 9 calories for every gram of a lipid. And so when your body runs out of that easily accessible carbohydrates, it will then start to break down lipids next for energy. But to clarify the structure of lipids, a monomer is this carbon and hydrogen and oxygen chain, and we see them right here. Triglycerides are a polymer of a lipid, and it has 3 of these monitors kind of hanging off this row right here, and that's why they're called triglycerides, is because there's 3 of them. We will learn more about phospholipids when we talk about the cell membrane, but a phospholipid is 2 of these fatty acids stuck together in one phosphate. Hydrophilic head, which is part of the phosphate group, and a hydrophobic tail. So the head part, which is this purple part up here, is hydrophilic. And the tail part, everything that's hanging off of that, is hydrophobic. So this is water, water loving, and this is water fearing. So it's definitely not water loving. So it's just part of the molecule where part of it will interact with water and part of it does not like water. And you probably know this if you've ever gone to boil spaghetti or something and you put a little bit of oil inside of the water before you put your spaghetti in there. The oil kind of hangs out together and it floats to the top. Overall, the molecule is, the lipid is hydrophobic. It doesn't like water. It doesn't interact with water. And that's because of this structure like this. The phospholipid bilayer, that is a very special lipid. It's actually two layers turned in on top of one another, and that actually makes up the plasma membrane of all of our cells in our body. So here we have that head and then the little tails that are coming off of it, and you can see here that they're inverted on each other. And so this double layer of phospholipids creates this barrier for our cells that is selective in what it'll let in. For the most part, since this part is hydrophobic, it keeps water on the outside. That way our cells are not just constantly being flooded with water. There's some barrier between each of our cells and the outside world. Moving on to proteins. Proteins' main function, it's hard to say what their main function is because they have so many different functions. I mean, they basically run our body. Certain types of proteins are like enzymes. They control the rate or help the rate of how biological chemical reactions happen in our body. And then things like hormones, which you're teenagers, you've probably heard a lot of stuff about hormones. Hormones regulate some cell processes in our bodies, and even insulin is an example of a hormone. Structurally, they make up bones and muscles. An example of that structural protein would be collagen. You might have heard of that molecule before on infomercials for lotions that'll make you look younger. Proteins are also part of our transportation system, transporting substances in and out of the cell like hemoglobin. Proteins are also antibodies. And we've heard a lot about that in the news lately. Antibodies help our immune system fight off all kinds of disease, and so antibodies are made of proteins. Another completely different type of protein is the contractile protein, and these are proteins that are more like sliding fibrous types, and they're part of our cardiac muscles inside of our heart. Remember that phospholipid bilayer I was just talking about? Well, inside of it are buried receptors, and they help the cell signal things, whether it's signaling to some other part of our body that it is there, or if it's trying to signal something to bring into it. And also, it's a good energy source. Proteins are in a lot of different foods that we eat, and they provide our body with energy. Proteins are found in meat, nuts, a lot of dairy products, and many of them are made by someone else's, muscle tissue or more body. They have a little bit more element variety in them. They're composed of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, along with nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur. Their monomer is called an amino acid, and a polymer is a chain of amino acids, and the polymer is called a polypeptide. So amino acids will link themselves together and form a polypeptide or peptide bond. Proteins are going to give us 4 calories per gram, and remember though that they do so much more than just provide energy for the body. I mean, your body will usually break down proteins as a last resort for energy because it needs it for all of those other functions we talked about. In fact, proteins are even more important because they do this folding structure. Proteins are the most diverse macromolecule in terms of their structure and how they function. There's 4 different levels to a protein, and the form that the protein takes on will often dictate its function. The shape of the protein determines basically what it does. So here we have the primary structure of a protein. Remember I said the peptide bonds, amino acids linking together? A secondary structure will often form this alpha helix, also known as like a beta sheet, and it'll start to twist on itself. Kind of looks like DNA, but don't get it confused because it's not. And then once it forms this like twisted structure, it'll start to overall twist on itself, and we call that a tertiary structure. When we get these tertiary structures, then we can combine another tertiary structure and another tertiary structure and another one forming together, and we call that a quaternary structure. So primary, secondary, tertiary, and quaternary. Technically, it only has to be 2 or more of these tertiary structures together to be a quaternary structure. And finally, nucleic acids. The main function of these guys is they're informational molecules that store, they transmit, and express genetic information. They also contain the instructions for making all of those different kinds of proteins. They're found in our DNA and RNA, and you basically get them from your parents. You're not going to get them from the food that you eat. So these are 0-calorie macromolecules. They're composed of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, along with nitrogen and phosphorus. Nucleic acid's monomer is called a nucleotide. It's made up of this phosphorus, this sugar, and a base. There are 4 different, technically 5 different types of bases of nucleic acids: adenine, guanine, thymine, cytosine, and uracil, which is specific to just the RNA component. These are all made up of this 5-carbon sugar. It's called a 5-carbon sugar because it looks like the pentagon. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's actually where the carbons are on the molecule. This phosphate group, so this is the element phosphorus, and this nitrogen-containing base. All right, so the nucleotide of nucleic acids is its monomer, and its polymer is nucleic acids. DNA is made up of nucleic acids. Nucleic acids are made up of nucleotides. Nucleotides are the smallest component of a nucleic acid. That's the phosphorus, the sugar, and the base.